All right, welcome everyone to the 2022 Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival, and thank you for joining us for Dead Excited, a folk necromancy panel with Dr. Alexander Cummins, Jesse Hathaway Diaz, and Dr. Ben Joffe. Dr. Alexander Cummins is a contemporary cunning man and historian. His magical specialties are the dead, folk necromancy, divination, geomancy, and the grimoires. His published works include an excellent book of the art of magic with Phil Legard, the Starry Rubric, a book of the Magi, lore, prayers, and spellcraft of the three holy kings, and contributions to collections by Three Hands Press, Hadean Press, and Scarlet Imprint. He is a frequent speaker on the international circuit, co-hosts the podcast Radio Free Golgotha, and is founding editor of the Revelore Press Folk Necromancy and Transmission series. Dr. Cummins' work, classes, and services can be found at alexandercummins.com. Welcome, Dr. Al.
Hiya.
Jesse Hathaway Diaz is a folklorist, artist, performer, and independent scholar with a master's in performance studies from NYU. With initiations in several forms of witchcraft from Europe and the Americas, he's also a lifelong student of Mexican curanderismo and initiated priest of Obatala in the Lukumi Orisha tradition and Atata Kimbanda. He co-hosts an occult-themed podcast called Radio Free Golgotha and edits the Folk Necromancy and Transmission series from Revelore Press. For the better part of 2 decades, he has been involved with theater group Jaichi, a New York-based experimental theater ensemble which explores theater and ritual as a way, blending service with self-exploration and performance. Dividing his time between the Bronx and a farm in the Hudson Valley, his artistic and written work navigate the world as magic through exploring orality and transmission, decolonialism, ritual theory and praxis, herbalism, and healing modalities through private study, apprenticeship, and community involvement. Welcome, Jesse.
Hola, how are you doing?
Good. Ooh, I gotta lit it. Dr. Ben Joffe is an anthropologist, diviner, translator, and editor currently based in Cape Town, South Africa. He holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Colorado, Boulder, with a specialization in the anthropology of Tibet, Tibetan Buddhism, religion, magic, tantra, and the globalization of esoteric traditions. His doctoral dissertation fieldwork in India, Nepal, Tibet, and the United States focused on Tibetan Buddhism Ngapa, I probably did not pronounce that right, non-celibate, non-monastic sorcerer yogis, and the ways in which knowledge and practices have been circulated, mediated, appropriated, and contested as part of increasingly transnational networks and economies. As a scholar and practitioner of Tibetan Vajrayana with a long history of involvement in Western magical and esoteric traditions, Ben is especially interested in overlaps and divergences between Indo-Tibetan and Western esoteric traditions, and the messy exchanges and blurry divisions that have arisen in interactions between so-called Western and so-called non-Western occultists. Ben has read tarot cards for clients since the age of 11, and he continues to offer divinatory services in between his full-time work as a translator, editor, and educator. He serves as head Tibetan translator and editor at Sky Press Books and works as a curriculum developer, teaching assistant for Sawa Rigpa Institute. Through publishing texts and developing educational programs, these organizations seek to make Tibetan medical, magical, and yogic traditions accessible to a broad array of students worldwide. More info about Ben's interests, research, and activities can be found at his blog, A Perfumed Skull, which is aperfumeskull.com. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, thank you.
Hello, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very excited, dead excited, one might say. Bunch. Wanted to start by telling you what the hell we're doing here today. I think that's a good way to begin. And one of those is to, this is the opposite, I hope, of a Webster's Dictionary defines beginning. But rather what I wanted to do was just introduce you to how I, and to an extent, my dear friends and co-moderators of the group, Ben and Jesse, have been laboring under when we talk about what the hell are we meant to be even talking about today. And the way we kind of ended up with that was to talk about at least describing, and again, not a Webster's definition, but just a description to move us forwards, and a target to attack as well as we see fit. But we thought about it in terms of the practices, philosophies, histories, and methodologies of necromancy, nigromancy, spirit conjuration, ghost lore, charmcraft, demonology, and working with the dead in world traditions: extant, extinct, historical, literary, and revived. So that was the core kind of like muster point for us. So what are we going to talk about this evening? Well, our kind of skeletal structure along with this lovely self-portrait of myself and my lovely panelists here, tag yourselves, is to go over just a little bit of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to do the intro, i.e. this bit now, which, straight out the gate, I think we're nailing. Then I'm going to talk about some interesting things about early modern European folk necromancies. I think they're interesting, and my endeavor is in a little 10 minutes to try and hopefully get you interested in them as well. Then Ben is going to talk about folk necromancy in Tibet, convergences and contrasts. Very excited about that. And then Jesse is going to talk folk by necessity, folk by default, Creole and Mestizo necromancies in the New World, and I'm excited for that too. Then we're going to have not a massive argument, but considered discussion about some of these themes that have emerged in these little 10-minute tapas to get us started, as it were. And then we're going to open it up for a wider Q&A with the lovely people here on the Zoom, and to maybe keep our discussion going. So that's about the shape of the dancing skeleton of today. So I hope you're up for that. That's what we're going to intend to do, at least. And that really means that it's up to me to do the first 10, and we're doing all right. Okay, so some interesting early modern European folk necromancies. Some of the issues I think are interesting. I'm going to talk about the nigromantic umbrella, if we will, to cast shade straight away. I want to talk a little bit about inverse hagiography and a little bit about ideas not just of the uncanny dead across Europe, but also occasionally what I have been thinking about as the abetting dead, and even the potential of them to be in some way to change after death, if not exploring concepts with heavy scare quotes around it, probably should have put those in, around elevation of the dead. I'm also going to talk, or at least show you briefly, some operations that I think are interesting. And again, there is a tendency towards #dead magicians, everyone take a drink, but also the idea of what these interactions with the living and the dead look like, not just as these grand climactic big ceremonial events, but also in the minutiae and in the quotidian engagement of everyday interactions between the living and the dead too. And also the idea of not just being a comfort, but an actual aid in some way. So the nigromantic umbrella is a very broad thing. Perhaps the broadest category, if we want to try and pick apart necromancy and nigromancy by extension of black magics or of sinister things, is a labeling theory, black magic is any magic we don't like. That's the broadest category, and it's not necessarily an unhelpful one. I'm going to move to a historical framework a little bit more now to talk about how I hope it's relevant for us to talk about early modern, or at least pre-modern concerns, because necromancy is a broad but specific medieval category of magic, necromantia. And invariably, all of the books on this introduce it by saying, I know you're excited about raising an undead army, but most medieval necromancy doesn't really feature the dead. It is basically trafficking with spirits of any sort for almost any reason at all. And we can kind of, that's a very broad brushstrokes. There are some particularities to it. It's partly down to an older medieval idea that magic is inherently not unnatural, but maybe in not quite in accordance with God's plan, and that most spirits are probably devils. This leads us on to the sense of necromancy and nigromancy specifically being about devils and unclean spirits as well as the dead, and also fairies sometimes as well, because they live there too. They share. There's roommate kind of arrangements going on between the dead and fairies sometimes. This also brings up ideas about familiar spirits and where we get our magic from, let alone how we practice it and send it out to do things. This idea of the dead and demons being kind of interlinked in various ways is also partly down to older ideas, pre-Christian ideas around chthonic spirits, and that not every spirit in a grave, or that you might encounter in a graveyard, was ever a dead person, right? There are spirits of the dead, daimonos of the dead. So on the one hand, there's a sympathy for some spirits called demons for the dead. And then there's also the Protestant paranoia that maybe that's not really grandma coming back to tell you where she hid the will. Maybe that's three demons in a grandma suit designed to, cause more family tensions or something. One of the other sides, when we get into away from the formality of like how much Latin in nigromantia and in necromantia, is this idea that like maybe if this is just cavorting with, trafficking with unclean spirits. This is just necromancy with more Latin and even more of a superiority complex. And this is backed up by, say, James I/6's demonology, where he says, you know, witches will worship the devil and necromancers will try and boss it around with the divine names of God. So we're into some territory of looking at where this butts up against and is the same as occasionally witchcraft. So a very intersectional necromancy, hopefully. Finally, this component of pre-modern necromancy I'm interested in is also about the suspicious books of secrets. And in recent years, there have been a couple of historians arguing that because this stuff is way more literate and Latin, that we don't really need to look for any female necromancers. And as someone very interested in cunning folk, especially the cunning folk cavorting with unclean spirits, I don't really think that bears up in the historical record. I think there are plenty of lady grimoirists doing astonishing Galicia and cunning craft. This image I like because it kind of gives you the idea of this monstrousness of everything as well as the dead that's included in nigromancy. And I'm not exactly sure where this particular beast falls in the monster manual, but in my headcanon, this is a very consensual act and everyone's having a great time. So inverse hagiography of necromancers is about this contagious transference between necromancers across time of specific stories about them that get overlaid on other ones. This happens with general hagiographic blur a lot. One Saint John becomes, if not equated, then mentioned in the same breath as another, or sometimes said confused, which itself, you know, implies some a scholarly figure being like, these folk practicing this saint stuff don't really know what they're doing, do they? The enormous condescension of history. This is very familiar in standard hagiography, but it seems to happen a lot with not just necromancers, but occult philosophers who get called necromancers a lot. As soon as you're in the ground, it seems, it's fair game for people to start wondering what you were building in your spirit room and how come you got all those, you know, he gets a lot of packages, but he doesn't have a lot of friends. You know, it's very Tom Waits, what's he building in there? This image, which is generally said to be John Dee and Edward Kelly in a graveyard at St. Leonard's near Pendle or around Pendle, isn't originally. It occurs in Paul Weaver's Ancient Monuments of 1623. And it's a great example of how in the Middle Ages, there were, or very late Middle Ages, there's said to have been some necromancer who did something important at St. Leonard's Church. Fast forward to 100 years after Dee and Kelly are dead, people remember that some necromancer did it, and the most famous necromancer they can think of is Dee, and so it must have been Dee, even though we know the dates, historically speaking, don't line up with Dee's biography. So if you're a good enough necromancer, eventually it's, or bad enough, you could say as well, you're going to be slid into a lineage of other people's necromancy that happened before you, whether you like it or not. I also love this concept of the abetting dead. Not all folks in the pre-modern period across Europe thought that the dead were just eternally sleeping until Judgment Day. John Hadean, idiosyncratic Rosicrucian and geomantic sorcerer, and picky ghost, Ponce, was very into this notion of that the dead are awake, that they are wandering around, that they're looking for a good time. And then that can include going on holiday, doing nice things that you would do when you're alive. There's a sense of like retired dead here I like, but that they're not just watching things that they like or drawn to watching the football team that they loved and supported in life. They might actually turn up and start giving advice to the people doing the same thing. I love this concept of craft as unfinished business, of not just like, oh God, I've got to, you know, stop people sending my kids to the workhouse, or I've got to like avenge the death of my father from my cruel uncle who has now married my mom, and it's all got very awkward around the dinner table. We're also talking about like abetting them in some way. And Hadean likens it to Hadean, saying that like old men or country parsons, they can give advice to people bowling. I've talked to some necromancers about this perspective. They find it very patronizing. But I like this idea that you would be drawn to what you love in life. And in fact, Hadean also has all sorts of ideas about particularly excellent souls who, you know, when they loved baking so much, they turned up and haunted that bakery, not throwing things off the wall, but like whispering in the ears of the new rookie baker of like how he can do better bread and things like that. And then made genii, which for Hadean heavily implies, if not literally means, they are, if not planetary spirits that can be informed by the stirring of the airs that we do in a variety of planetary magics. And again, they're in society of the airs with these genii, and they wrap themselves in the airs. And so this sense of alluring the dead through how we flavor the air, that they might help us, is really interesting to me. We're going to talk dead magicians. For me, that kind of reached a head at one point when I was working on the excellent book, The Art of Magic, with my good friend Phil Legard. A set of operations that occur around in 1567, and that feature the manuscript we have has not only the grimoire but also its scrying record. It's behind the scenes of how they came up with the grimoire, which, spoiler alert, a bunch of dead magicians turned up and told them how to do it. These guys. And this fired a very particular engagement with that kind of stuff. We find the idea of tutelary spirits turning up a bunch partly. We find it through not just demons, but full-on fallen angels. So the excellent book begins its conjurations with an appeal to Azazel, the fallen angel, the scapegoat. And this is very common in the 16th century. We see a variety of these operations dedicated to asking the keeper of dead men's bones and the ruler of the dead if the ghost can come out and play, please, and come and like deliver me an excellent book, or treasure, or or favors from my boss, or what have you. And these operations are fascinating because they to me they speak to the materiality of the dead. Where in some of these versions you take earth and put it in clean linen and create a little haunted pillow for yourself to practice dream incubation and those kinds of things. These are also durational and take place over time and require a back and forth between you and a licensing figure of the dead, this chthonic figure. Azazel is infamous for supposedly teaching humans how to make weapons and cosmetics. Terrible, terrible, terrible spirit. And that, by the way, is the seal of Zazel, not the spirit of seal of Azazel. To stand on my soapbox for 10 seconds, friends don't let friends use the seal of Zazel for Azazel. Okay, right, and breathe out, and breathe. Okay, so materiality, speaking to a demon to bring a ghost to you to do useful things. We also see that in the Haunted Pillow homeschooling of a construction of a packed bundle for dreaming and ongoing exchange with a tutelary spirit that we find. It's an operation attributed to the 13th century astrologer and an occult philosopher, Michael Scott. That's Michael Scott, necromancer, not the one from the American Office. It's found in Brian's Necromancy in the Magicke Library. It's about getting 3 demon kings to recruit and assign you a ghost teacher. It involves a very literal account of dove's blood ink. In fact, uses the heart of the dove as a pen. There are multiple stages of consecration, and the cloth, the haunted pillow, is added to after each next step of the successful operation. You have to dream that you meet them and that they tell you their name, and then you write that down. Again, these operations that aren't just about a bunch of prep so that I can finally have an awkward first date with whatever the spirit is, but rather meeting them over time, getting to know them, getting to know their likes and dislikes, their turn-ons and turn-offs, adding that into the work to make the work more potent, and that the relationship, like the work, can be sharpened by use. Finally, I want to just briefly mention that I'm really interested in these operations, mostly from thralldom, from Swedish and wider Scandinavian cunning crafts in the graveyard. And they often involve this practice of borrowing bones, where you go and ask permission from the graveyard, if not from the specific dead person, to borrow a bone and do useful things with it. One of the standard things that's done, if we're going to talk about help from the dead, is healing. One of the standard ways of healing is to transfer disease or a malady from, say, your gammy arm with the bone of the dead that you've borrowed, and then you ask the dead to take that back with them when you replace it respectfully to the land of the dead. Classic transference, right? The dead turn up, take something away with them. It's trash day. This operation is fascinating to me because we borrow the bones, we heat them up, we make this soup, we make this healing wash, and then we put the bones back. The bones never touch someone, right? Then we wash the sick person and recite a very, very, very long prayer. My point here is that healing virtue is coming from the dead here. We're not just healing because we're taking away disease to the land of the dead. And that's fascinating to me. And I'm excited to talk about any and all of those kinds of themes. And that is my not quite type 10. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to take a breath and then pass it over to Jesse. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Is it me already? I thought I was going third. All right.
Oh, no, right, no, yes, you're quite right. No, we're in Ben next. I'm so sorry. It's this thing here. That's my fault. Right. Sorry, Ben. You're like,
No problem. Let me share. Okay, hang on. I should make this full screen, right?
That looks good to me.
Presentation mode, right?
Sure.
That's better, right?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Al. I feel like it's too late here for me to talk as fast and efficiently as you did, but I will try. So I thought that what I would do just for this initial discussion, my wheelhouse, as you heard before, is Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. And so I wanted to look at this concept of folk necromancy and some of the implicit ideas around it, which you may or may not share in the audience, and think about it in terms of Tibetan Tantric Buddhist practice and see how that works. So initially, it's quite easy to see how, in many respects, Vajrayana, or more properly Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, because they're not quite the same, certainly aligns with so many of the things that Al was just laying out for us. Perhaps this is a bit simplistic, but we can really think fairly, I think, of Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana in general, as being Mahayana Buddhism, as being the sort of quest or the vision of the Bodhisattva empowered or empowered by or exploiting long-standing technologies of necromancy and of ritual magic. That really is what Vajrayana is. It's an accelerating of the vision of Mahayana by using, as I say, tantric and pre-tantric magical technologies, which were long-standing in India. And so already that gives us an interesting kind of domain to explore, because when talking about Tantric Buddhism, all of this kind of, there's so much magic, folk or otherwise, that's being incorporated into this larger Buddhist project. So that's the kind of general thing I wanted to mention at the beginning. And then, as many of you will be familiar, Tibetan Tantric Buddhism includes many transgressive, charnel ground, graveyard magical practices, engaging with spirits, making offerings, developing relationships with spirits of various kinds, especially any and all of the type that Al was discussing. Spirits, the human dead, unruly, unclean spirits, aggressive spirits, like I said here, propitiating those spirits, making pacts with them, conjuring them, exorcising them, subjugating them, enlisting them as friends, servants, redirecting their talents, spirits of the land, the restless dead, exceptionally predatory spirits, potentially harmful spirits connected with death and disease. These are all absolutely part of the wheelhouse of Tantric Buddhism, as is also, I think, most people are familiar with, the ritual use of human remains, often in quite an explicit way. So you can see in the slide here, I'm assuming many of you will be at least a little bit familiar with the practice of chud, which is a particular type of Tibetan Tantric meditation, ritual practice, spirit offering practice. Here you can see a chupa, a practitioner of chud meditation, holding a cunning, a human thigh bone trumpet. There is a toba, or kapala, as many people know it in Sanskrit, a python and goat skin chud drum. There we see again the damaru, double-headed drum. In this case, this is a drupchen, a mahasiddha, a famous Indian master called in Tibetan Napochoba, or Krishnacharya. He was an Indian tantric saint who was especially known for doing things with zombies. So there you can see a zombie, a rolang servant that he has. He first squatted, he meditated on the zombie, and then called in various available spirits to animate the zombie, and then accomplish certain magical acts with its help. And there you see an artistic rendering of a toba, of a skull cup filled with blissful nectar blood. So these, for better or worse, are familiar iconography to a lot of people. So right off the bat, even just sort of superficially, aesthetically, we can definitely see distinct necromantic features and practices in Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. No kind of major arguments there. Secondly, if we look more historically at the establishing of the sort of real grounding of Tantric Buddhism in Tibet, many of you also know that the kind of key mythical moment of indigenizing of Indian Tantric Buddhism in Tibet was when Padmasambhava, otherwise known as the precious Guru, Guru Rinpoche, freewheeling tantric necromancer. I mean, I can think of no better way to describe him. Absolutely, he was a necromancer and a necromancer for hire, according to history. He came to Tibet, and at the time, in a way, very reminiscent of the Testament of Solomon and these kinds of Solomonic myths we might be more familiar with in a European context. Guru Rinpoche was called in because the monastic missionaries from India did not have the sufficient familiarity with unclean, unruly spirits to call them up and bind them with enough power to ensure that the first sort of major Buddhist training college, Samye, could be built in central Tibet with state patronage. And so Guru Rinpoche, in a way that should be quite familiar to us from, you know, a more European grimoire context, sequentially calls up all of the various spirits which are hampering the work of building this temple, using mirror divination, child seers, children possessed by these spirits. He extracts oaths from them in various ways, and they become kind of the bouncers of Tibetan Buddhism subsequently. So this should all be very familiar again. And then another way in which necromancy really comes in strongly is in the context of tantric initiation into a lineage, which, as I've said here, implies an insertion into a continuum of empowering blessings, a continuum that is really understood to be unbroken from mythic time. So here on the side, you can see a kind of classic representation of a lineage tree, which would be visualized in any kind of sadhana. And all the way at the top, you have the primordial naked Buddha in ecstatic union, Samantabhadra, Samantabhadri, Kuntusambo in Tibetan, Kuntusamo. Any sadhana, any tantric Buddhist sadhana inevitably involves invoking the blessings of the lineage. And what that means is invoking the time and space transcending insights, the realization, the awareness and power of generations of dead sorcerers into the visualized forms. And there are very specific stages in sadhana practice where this is done. Really, the fuel that's powering the engine of sadhana practice is the absolute certainty that one is imbued, is marinated with the chinlap, the empowering blessings of more dead necromancers within who have already accomplished, and if you like, also you in the future having already accomplished the practice. All those blessings are called into the junction point of your practice. And as an extension of that, tantric initiation involves this idiom of kinship. The guru is the parent. Your parents gave you a precious human body, which is allowing you to do these practices now for enlightenment, but your guru is the one who can help guide you out of samsaric suffering. And so they say has even greater weight, is even heavier with kindness than your own parents. And these familial ties involved in tantric initiation are with the living and the dead, and the human and the non-human. Now, where do things diverge a little? It's when we get to the folk part of folk necromancy, because there are a lot of assumptions around what folk magic or folk necromantic practice looks like from that sort of folk point of view. In Tibet, we have a really different system obtaining to what you might see in medieval or Renaissance Europe. In Tibet, we have tantric necromancy functioning as mainstream state religion. I can't sort of stress that more. The most transgressive charnel ground necromantic practices are also statecraft at the highest level, at the most public subsidized level. Magical expertise in Tibet is a virtuoso activity. It's frequently elite, restricted, and regulated, but it's not we're not talking about secret forbidden books. It's not heterodox or punishable, underground, marginal, heretical, dubious in quite the same way. There are moments where certain practices, if practiced a certain way by certain people, may be looked askance at. But we have to remember that these are so thoroughly mainstreamed. As I said here in brackets, transgressive left hand, there's, I often sort of point this out. There's no term in Tibetan language for left hand path like there is in Sanskrit, Vama Marg, because there's no right hand path in Tibet. There was no need to translate the term in quite the same way as you see in Indian Tantra context, because here, as you can see, everyone's favorite jolly, palatable a spiritual guide, the Dalai Lama, is, there's some stuffed lions behind him, and you can see he's wearing human bones as an apron here. This is not an image we normally see of him, but he is a tantric necromancer. That is his role, especially in the context of being an initiating guru. So I really want to stress here that while, of course, there is folk magic and folk propitiation of spirits, folk ritual practice in the sense of lay householders who are not ritual specialists, still making offerings to spirits, still engaging in what we'd consider magical practices, they do this even so under the auspices of an authenticating lineage, of being plugged into that tantric continuum. Magic expertise in Tibet is not really something that can really sort of be intelligible outside of the encompassing authoritative structures of institutionalized magical tantric Buddhism. You see, and this is the clincher. From the Tibetan Vajrayana perspective, anyone can do magic, but only Buddhists can do it in an enlightened or enlightening way. So this creates an interesting dynamic where non-Buddhist magic can quickly become Buddhist if it's incorporated with the right view and motivation. And even technically, officially Buddhist magic can fail to be so if it's not done with a bodhisattva intention. And so this is a real dynamic. We don't see the same thing about heretical, diabolical, sorcerous undergrounds, but rather concern around whether, the most extreme or the most, bloodless kind of magical practices are being done with the attitude of a Buddhist or not. So this raises a lot of questions we can discuss in greater detail later, perhaps, but we're dealing basically with a different distribution of knowledge and expertise around esoteric lineage transmission. And in Tantric Buddhism, there is so much appeal to prior authority and precedence. We could even say there really is a kind of magic of reiteration, of reprisal and renewal. What this means is that in Tibetan context, innovation is really a dirty word. It's a discrediting concept. And so there's very interesting ways in which disguise and denial happen. Of course, magical practitioners, spiritual adepts are innovating constantly, but there's never a context in which it's okay to say, I made this. Tantric texts often say at the end specifically, Ransomeba, like this text was written without anything fabricated by my own mind. So you have a very interesting dynamic where incorporation and taming becomes the main idiom through which all sort of ritual practice and magic can be understood. In Tibetan context, to convert an area or a group of people, doa is the word, it literally means to tame. It isn't so much, did we go around with our pamphlets, knock on the door, get enough people to let us inside and talk to them about Buddha. It's more about, were we able, like Guru Rinpoche before, to successfully domesticate and incorporate the animating presences of this place into a mandala of tantric power, into a cosmogram in which beings and energies which might initially seem like they're outside of the scope or the ambit of enlightened activity can be incorporated. So when Tibet was truly converted, it wasn't when the kings were converted. It wasn't when people started practicing Buddhism or self-identifying. It was when the protective, autochthonous, ancestral deities of the Tibetan landscape, the very sentient landscape itself, was incorporated and integrated into a tantric vision through what we could call mandalization. And this is a process which is still happening now in Tibetan communities. So it's almost comical, even if what we would consider a folk visionary, let's say a Tibetan nomad who is illiterate, who's received no training in sort of elite tantric monastic education of any kind. They have no guru, they have no teacher, but they find they have a spontaneous ability to heal. They're having visions or communicating with spirits. When this happens, incorporation, or you could say doa, taming, is very fast. What will happen is we'll have integration into existing structures. So a very, very typical way in which this is done is reincarnation, rebirth. So someone will say, why am I having these visions? It's because in a previous lifetime, Guru Rinpoche already transmitted teachings to me and I was an initiated tantric practitioner. And so then maybe another Lama will say, you know what, you're an untrained folk healer, but you're not actually, because I also remember you from 300 years ago. And I hate to break it to you, but you said you were going to finish building a monastery and you didn't. And I'm the reincarnation of your friend from that time. And so you've got to come and hang out with me and become incorporated into my sort of sphere of activity. I've met lamas who've said that they kind of have spam folders, if you like, of letters, actual physical letters and invitations from other lamas who have recognized them as various reincarnations. And while they may believe that that's true in the infinite round of their rebirths, they're choosing not to pay attention to those recognition letters because they know that if they do, they'll become swept up in a kind of mandala, if you like, of necromantic activity. And we see this too with the identification of local sort of regional folk spirits or even dead humans as reborn deities or as emanations of well-known high-ranking Buddhist deities. Or, you know, if someone becomes possessed by a small scale spirit or lesser known spirit, it might then be discovered that medium might be told that they then have to submit a kind of tribute to an existing recognized Buddhist oracle with a place within a monastic structure. And so we see regulatory and corporative bureaucratic structures and lineages happening all the time. And this idea that because when one is plugged into a lineage, this goes beyond this life. So in a way, this complicated network of the distribution of tantric blessings means that even if you are an unaffiliated, innovative sort of folk practitioner, you probably won't stay that way for long. You'll be legitimized, either ignored until you disappear or legitimized until maybe your dirty innovation disappears as well. So I put these examples here of the Loch Ness Monster and of Bigfoot because there have been specific instances in recent decades where both beings have been incorporated into mandalas of lamas' activities, or when, and this is a classic example. What we see really in Tantric Buddhism, even in India, is that folk magical practices and local deities can be incorporated kind of at any point and at any level through this idiom of the mandala. The mandala always has at its center a fully realized Buddha, and at its periphery, kind of the unruly, sort of invited, partly participating, partially incorporated masses. And so the mandala allows a distribution from center to periphery and back again. and with the idea that the mandala is an emanative picture where ultimately the same enlightened energy is flowing through it, no matter how dark and kind of fringe the edges may appear. This becomes a very powerful mechanism through which Vajrayana can basically, you could say, deny innovation and folk resistance, while also incorporating it into this kind of Catholic structure. I don't think that this is specific to Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. I think we see this very much in some Catholic contexts as well, in a slightly different fashion because of the theology in question. But I'm not gonna, I probably talked for longer than 10 minutes. I haven't looked at the clock, but there's other things that we can talk about. One thing I liked about this mental exercise, what would folk necromancy in Tibetan context look like, is it made me think, okay, what would be truly folk? So we could talk about examples of small rituals that don't involve the intercession of elite ritual experts, like when parents rub soot on the corpse of a prematurely dead infant. It's called experimental birthmarking by some researchers, so that that child will be reborn in their same family. There's no official rituals around this, no tantric sadhanas, but it's a common practice that's done. If you have another child soon after the death of that one, you'll see a little mark, a little birthmark on the future reborn child's body in the place where the butter or the soot was put. And so there are ways in which people have familial folk practices that are somewhat invisible to mediating, regulating power structures. But I think more importantly, rather than saying what's the true folk unincorporated practice, is to realize that in a context like Tibet with, state-driven necromancy, perhaps the idea of folk versus high institutionalized elite practice isn't quite, we shouldn't be thinking of this in such a dualistic binary way. Instead, we should just be interrogating what's at stake in these moments where individual practitioners or individual spirits and their lives push against this sort of overarching umbrella, this pervasive set of tantric idioms and standards. And that can look like accommodation, negotiation, or conflict. So yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you. And yes, Jesse, what even is time? Especially after that talk, you shouldn't worry about it too much.
So I'm going to try and follow those two lovely gentlemen. I just realized the bad part about going third. Okay. Do I know how to use any technology? How do I do presentation? Play. That's what it is. I'm on a Mac. That's why. Can you see these slides okay? Can you? Awesome. Okay. So I'm looking at ultimately what's interesting to me about the term folk necromancy. And I realize one of the things that drives me with it is my research interests lie in a group of practices, in a spectrum of practices in the New World that are, they will never be described as anything but folk. So the idea of folk by necessity, folk by default, and there could be many titles to this, but Creole and Mestizo necromancies in the New World. This is less a formal presentation, as I don't think any of these are formal presentations, but explorations as to why this group, why these discussions are interesting, why the three of us find talking about this interesting, and why, even with the podcast and the introduction of folk necromancy being the focus of the group, to see where we go with this. So yeah, why not? Which Al lovingly defined. I think this is from the original FNet on the website. Is that right, Al? Yeah. So like, I remember when we went over the wording of this and how important it was to have the extant, historical, literary, and revived in there. There's probably more than that as to what these things are, because it's all so blurry. But to make sure, for me, having that extant in there is really important for the oral traditions and the the New World traditions that are not codified as much through the advent of writing and certainly more public. I was at an academic conference recently where in the study of European esotericism, where a co-presenter phrased, I said, well, where does the New World fit into European esotericism or the study of Western esotericism? And it was an interesting thing because without missing a beat, he was like, well, you guys appropriate a lot of European things. I was like, whoa. Let's start over here. My American like political ears just picked up when you said appropriate. So like, let's go back and expose or at least problematize so we can make this a generative conversation where I don't put your head on a plate and like actually have, a nice academic discourse for the next 4 hours over Chinese food. But to see what it means when you are someone who is inheriting something, but that's not all you inherit. And therefore, what is it when that gets reintroduced or you emphasize one thing over the other? And that side of it is something that's generated by the folk. It's not a state decision. I debated about white versus black on these things, and that's just for playing with visibility. But as long as I can read them, I suppose it's okay. But that immediately brings us to notions of folk versus state. And I put state as the opposite of folk there, not necessarily as the end all be all, but to understand that, I kind of follow this notion. I think it was Karen Armstrong, Fields of Blood. I quote her all the time. Hopefully that's still her name and I'm still not misquoting her. But the notion that religion evolved in parallel to the state, that religion itself evolved as a justification for the state's actions, and that there is no possible separation of church and state in it up until possibly some weird version of modernity where we mistake Judeo-Christianity values and then humanistic values as being universal. But this side of it being in contrast to folk practice, which will destroy that every time. There's always somebody who believes differently. There's always minority groups that believe differently. And so this notion of how religion gets practiced through an orthodoxy or an orthopraxis, which can exist on both sides of folk and state, although there are times where something like demonic summoning tends to be a little bit more orthopraxic and is borrowing things from the orthodoxy, from the right belief versus the like right practice. Ideas of innovation, which Ben just lovingly touched on, of like, is there such a thing as innovation? We always pass the buck, i.e. books of Saint Cyprian, i.e. channeled texts, the one president of Mexico who was a spiritist, and like that's part of his evolution of the country and the world consciousness is to like consult his spirits every night. And notions of indigeneity, which is, this is its own kind of, how do we define this? And there's this movement towards defining indigeneity that I just like the phrasing of, which is an understanding of a people who live in relationship to a land through generational solving of problems on that land. I'm not phrasing anything perfectly, but what I'm saying is the idea that there was a relationship with a given place that also includes the community helping to develop and problem solve the problems of that place. So I think that enters into notions of what folk necromancy is in the New World very heavily, because it's not just about some pure mythical past of like the inheriting an indigenous belief from 800 years ago that is, well, not 800, 500 years ago, right at the conquest, and then putting that into modern terms, like that is the only thing that can be believed of as indigeneity. But understanding that indigeneity is an ongoing process as done by indigenous peoples. That is an understanding of how things are interpreted, this rocks the boat, right, of what state versus folk is, the unbearable rightness of it all, the unbearable whiteness of it all, whatever we want to go there, in the idea that doubt is something only that for the colonized and the enslaved, because the colonizer believes they are right. So this internal thing is that you don't ever have to doubt that you're right if you're on that side coming in. And part of that speaks to the cultural mindset of that time and the Enlightenment and colonialism and all these things going on. But also, when you are members of the colonized or the enslaved, you start to believe that in part, that if you're going to do some version of your own tradition after this point, it often starts to include the things that were more powerful in your tradition, quote unquote, because you were taken away, that your power was taken away. So Jesus replaces, the god of war in central Mexico, or saints start being syncretized in, not just out of purposeful masking, but specifically as a way or as an inheritance of these multiple things going on. That generationally, there's a new indigeneity being formed, that people are interpreting these multiple streams of input here. So I have a lot of little pictures going on in the, like that was a forked juniper tree. If you're in the Southwest United States, that's like the necromantic tree. That's where you sell your soul to it, and like you turn into a witch bird, tecolote, that flies through the air. And like looking at this, of like there's the souls flying, wow, whatever the English word is, praying to the Virgin for release from the torments of purgatory and hell, which is its own lovely thing. And then also the kind of Cristianos y Moros, which is still done, which is, this is in Mexico itself. So you see someone portraying Jesus himself as the right conqueror over the natives, and the Christians and the Moors, which is the 1492 expulsion of the Moors from Spain, the Reconquista. That is a pivotal year. Not only does Columbus discover America, but you have the ousting of all of the official Islamic regimes and the Moors out. You also have no more Jewish people in Spain as well. So it is now a Catholic country. It's a big year for Spain. And then from that point, reenacting little plays in order to show how that becomes its own mythology. So the Moors in the situation become the indigenous peoples in the Americas. They're still referred to as the Moors, but they start to become the ousting of the pagan beliefs, the ousting of non-state oriented beliefs, but as portrayed through native lens, as portrayed by native costume, as portrayed by native dance. So value centers in the kind of what's his name? I can't remember now. But the idea that you can't delete a value center. It has to be embraced. It has to move forward. Just a little note about that background here. Anima Sola herself, the first time she appears as a single entity, like the one soul that you can work with, and the Juan Minero or these other ones, is in Mexican art history. Like we know that she appeared in Mexico. Italy has a strong tradition of the souls of the dead, but it doesn't ever have a shrine to one soul that you would work with. It was about relieving the suffering of the dead until the New World and its expressions. And then it reflexively went back to Europe and kind of moved through it. God bless those folk that are, mama birding each other. So notions of translation have to come up. And this is a small illustration of Malinche. If you know who she is, she was the indigenous woman who was enslaved went into slavery. She was Aztec by birth, or Nahuatl speaking, went and was a slave in a Mayan household, who then one of Cortez's contacts was a Spanish priest who also had been shipwrecked, and he spoke Maya and Castellano. And so in order for Cortez to speak to the Aztec king, he spoke in Castellano to his priest, or to his friend who spoke Maya. He spoke Maya to Malinche. Malinche then spoke Nahuatl to the emperor. So it's a telephone game. This is the whole conquest of the New World, the presenting of things, especially just in the microcosmic example of New Spain, i.e. Mexico. But this notion of translation is important, because when we're looking at what notions of language and text are, no language can be translated exactly. And one of the things that happened in the New World that sets us up for different folk necromancies is that there was no European model was thrown out the window, to the extent of they did not make native peoples learn Latin. Before, they stamped out local temples, burned, destroyed local groves, local centers of worship were built directly on top of them. They continued with that model. But what they did do is they translated the sacred word into native languages. And when you do that, you don't actually introduce new concepts. You introduce new ways of complicating old concepts. So if you're using native deity names as substitutes for the Christian deity names, you're just saying, okay, well, we have a new human sacrifice that happens only on Easter, and you've got to do the parade in this way. And as long as you don't revolt, we're doing okay. And that's kind of how things fit into the Catholic worldview, which is an important part of New World necromancies. There's also this idea of complicating the term language and text, that we also want to look at everything from body language, how dances are performed, how the cultural contextualization of like rituals that are endemic to a society, and how those are colonized or not, how those are brought into the fold. Mostly the Catholic Church in the New World didn't care as long as you weren't revolting. That's a different word than I meant to use. As long as you weren't in revolt. There we go. So that's we're going to explore that in a minute, but the notions of archive and repertoire come into play, right? So the Bible, the church has its catechism that is trying to enforce, and then it's saying, hey, do this in play version, because they're embracing theatrical performance means as a way to show to the native populace these basic tenets of the church, which was already a form that was popularly done. So you get this extreme This is Diana Taylor's theories coming in here of the notions of what is codified and what must be enacted, which is a very European impulse, right? This writing down, this codification of law, we don't vary from it. We're trying to interpret everything according to it, versus the repertoire, which starts to change, right? We're coming back to it yearly. And this year, we didn't have blue feathers, so now they're green feathers, and maybe green feathers mean something else than what blue feathers meant. But we don't have, things slowly change through the repetition of these things, as opposed to the archive, which is always there. And I use and it still goes on today in honor of Museum of Witchcraft, just in the sense that all things are living here. I'm focusing on that extant part. There are many extinct necromancies, perhaps in the New World, but there are so many extant that are still being practiced. What was the background? No, that's just the Christian Bible. Okay. So the big dick energy problem, the sheer size of it all, with the Spanish conquest and its landmass, what they ended up doing is they stopped caring about minor infractions against Catholic dogma. Like if somebody was doing love magic and got caught, they're like, I do not want to travel 1,800 miles over the course of however many months it takes through cholera-ridden water areas just to tell you, yeah, she did something wrong. So they didn't have enough inquisitors. They didn't have enough people to stop many of these practices because there was a sheer amount of size that was the New World. That was this Mexico, which went from, almost the Canadian border, or New Spain, excuse me, all the way down. And these colonization things that started implementing the church's law could never fully implement it. So as long as you had a church somewhere in that city and people gave a certain amount of tithe to it, just shut up about the love magic, shut up about even minor cursing, just unless the priest is attacked or where the money comes from, the peninsulares, the rich people who were ousted from Spain or chose to come over, that's its own thing. So there's just a lot going on with the sheer size of the New World. Getting into notions of syncretism, hybridity, liminality, multiple inheritances. The things that impress me about syncretism is important to note that it is not always voluntary. In fact, in history, rarely is it truly voluntary. It's generational. So someone might practice something where they don't want to get hit. They go through Stockholm syndrome and they start, showing a certain altar to a saint and think that this is a good way to do things. But the children of those people incorporate those things as one. Syncretism is, as one teacher pointed out, this is it's the cultural dominance onto a less dominant culture. So this is not a consensual relationship at its heart. This is something that happens because of a dominant culture. We can look at this also even in the sense of like what music becomes the top 20. This is not syncretism, but it's showing something along the lines of like, we don't have control over that. You can kind of engineer based on what you think is going to be up to the top 10 songs, and you can make derivative songs. You can be like, oh, I'm writing this trend, but you don't quite know because it's still put back into the populace. It's still determined by the folk as to how it goes. And the important notion with as far as multiple inheritances and hybridity and liminality, we talk a lot about liminality, especially in the witchcraft world, of how, we're all in the liminal. You can't work in the liminal all the time. If you are permanently in the liminal, it doesn't make sense. That's when hybridity becomes formed. And like, you can't be between two worlds at all times. Society hates it. It hates it. You can create new identities out of that. The folk will also move you forward. There's that Congolese proverb that I'm very fond of, listed by Foucault, of community is like honey. It's very sweet, but it's also very sticky. Like you can only move so far when you're subjected back to like the folk of it all. There's only so much folking around. But the idea here also, again, of multiple inheritance. You see in the larger photo, Mashimon San Simon, who's a heavily syncretized entity who's in Guatemala, which also starts appearing around the time when the Yoruba are freed by a group called the Crusoe, by a Mayan rebel group that went into Belize, freed Yoruba, came back into the Yucatan, and the Mayan also had a cult to working with dead kings. And you get all of these things merging together under a Catholic worldview, and Mashimon seems to be born in the early 1800s. There were examples of similar things to Mashimon and Mash and these tied power bundles. There were necromantic communications with previous leaders, but this thing that's here that's incorporating things that are very similar to working with the trickster deities of the Yoruba, there seems to be a lot of conflicts here. So there's, again, multiple inheritances. Here on the left, you see Guadalupe, the statue of the Aztec Earth Mother, being fused with Guadalupe. One is emerging from, or she is perhaps being swallowed by. It's hard to tell which direction it's going in. And I like that kind of weirdness of it. Yeah, what is Creole and Mestizo? Creole originally means that you're born in this, this hemisphere, the new world, because I'm in the Western hemisphere right now, but you have parents from the peninsula, from Spain, from Portugal. It has come to mean things that are mixed with African inheritance, which is an interesting shift in how that goes. Mestizo is generally the other side, that it has indigenous inheritance. And there are, in Mexico, there's 36 different racial terms at the height of the colonial era. I think Brazil had even more. But like as to which percentage you are, were your parents born in Spain or were they born in a colony, where, what is the nobility here, and how many different forms of mixture you are. But mestizo ultimately means misogynized. And so in English, it sounds really weird. So like in Spanish culture, we refer to ourselves like, I'm mestizo, like my mother has indigenous blood, my mother has European blood, and we're proudly mestizo. There's a myth side to it too. It's also, in promoting that myth, it means that people who are 80 to 90% indigenous then identify so heavily with the myth of the mestizaje that they then erase a lot of their indigeneity, that gives them this need to conform to the European. My interest as far as folk necromancy, because really that's what this 10 minutes is about, this is how can this be explored without the promise of new natives? Like, can we do a no new natives? Can it be something other than constantly an intro to this group of people that you never heard about? Can it be something other than here's a new pantheon, here's a new way of working with materials that is ultimately about revivifying someone's existing practice and not actually about learning in any way that is productive or entering into a relationship with the very material that they're studying. And so this is where it's a challenge to myself, even in being excited about talking about things that I've things that I've read, things that I've found out, things that I've interpreted, whatever these things are, but what is the relationship? So ultimately I'm looking at it through, for me, the decolonialist lens of language as a relationship, not language as a commodity. Demon, deity, dead, and saint, these things blur. Did I forget to describe what it was? The Columbus, doing stupid things and beautiful Nahuatl deities there. But so the notion of what is a demon, what is a deity, what are the dead, what is a saint, this is all going to get blurred in the folk necromancies of the New World. And so you see in the background there, this is a matachine, if you're familiar with this practice, this is Mexican, of the indigenous dances that were preserved are allowed to be performed in front of the church. And then at some point, a conch is blown and everybody goes into the church and salutes the altar. Then they sit down and they come out of their costume and have mass. This is done in any group area that has heavy indigenous population. There's the different regional matachines dancing styles are codified to their area. But there's also this larger impulse to make everything very Aztec because they were defeated, and because of this knowledge that became especially in Mexico, but even larger indigenous populations of the larger Mexico, meaning the Southwest and down into Central America, the Aztecs were like the lingua franca, right? It freezes the indigenous in time and says there's no more indigenous people after that, which is going to be something that happens, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. But and the Gertrude Stein quote of in Mexico, anything could be a saint. We're talking about utilitarianism. Is it useful? It's a saint. Is it not useful? Not a saint today. Could be a saint tomorrow. Might have been a saint yesterday, but is it a saint today? No, because Santo is about holiness. Santo is about utilitarianism. And so this idea of the holy dead, it's like this dead starts working miracles for someone, then that's a folk saint. It starts being approached through the Catholic means of adoring something, but it is not necessarily a recognized saint. This does not mean saints that have fallen out of practice, because you can look at, so I can serve, for instance, Saint Cyprian, our illustrious saint of necromancy. I can serve him through both Orthodox Catholic means, through folk Catholic means, and through the kind of shunning of Catholic means that's happening with certain people that want to work with a saint but don't want to work with anything Christian. There's these different ways that are happening, which are all folk, right? So except for perhaps the Orthodox Catholic side of working with things. One would argue that in Catholicism, is there such thing as truly state other than what's the archive there. But yeah, this is the Tsitsimime. It's a drawing of the Lady Star demons that are many of the female deities are associated with her, but she's always depicted with a skull face, and she has a energetic phallus of a rattlesnake to show how deadly she is, associated with the Pleiades constellation. Good lady. But this notions of modernity, always looking at this from modernity starts in Haiti, right? We've got to look at everything from this Enlightenment inheritance. The great time stop of, when the Aztecs are conquered, it stops the time for 18 or whatever, 18,000 miles. I'm just saying it stops time. Natives don't exist in modernity. And this is part of the great weapon of it all. So to look at Creole and folk necromancies, you're always referring, there's this idea and kind of hearkening back to something that's influenced much of magical thought and the study of magical thought in the 20th century, which is the Golden Bough. And Fraser's idea that religion evolves from magic. And that timeline, that arrow in one direction where magic evolves into religion, was really advanced for the time in accepting that these people that weren't as religion as you recognize it, meaning they didn't practice any of the Chris Lemieux faiths, or perhaps the kind of eternal philosophization of Buddhism into something other than a religious practice. But the notion of religion itself is complex, right? Like that's, al-din does not translate to religion in Islam, it's the way you live. So this notion kind of freezes things and says that, well, if I don't recognize it as something that I would call religion, then it's further back in time. They're more primitive. And this primitivism is both embraced as well as shunned in all of these practices. You're allowed to be more primitive if it's your tradition. You're allowed to look more primitive if it's your tradition. You're not allowed to heap primitivism upon another tradition unless you're actively trying to denigrate them. So this is an interesting side of it. This notion again of extant versus extinct. There are so many traditions that are extant. There are many traditions that are fully private and are not intended to be viewed. There is no supposition here of the inheritance of like a Protestant egalitarianism, where if you can ask the question, you deserve an answer. That is so far from most West and Central African mindsets that you don't deserve an answer just because you want it. There's no guarantee, there's no reason to share everything with everybody. That is not how these systems work, especially when we're dealing with ideas of necromancy, where we're dealing with the dead. If its tradition is that this deity incarnated and passed down a cultic practice to its followers, to its descendants, and you're not one of those descendants, why should it even be shared with you? So there's this idea of having to be adopted into the family, which is a part of a larger acculturation process that happens in these necromancies. But ultimately, we're also dealing with heavy notions of that archive and repertoire again, and textual versus oral traditions and orality itself. Orality including more than just textual transmission. So orality including dance and cultural practices. These are true paradigmatic shifts. The dead are not the same as they were there. And the dead are so complexified because there's so many groups being put. As you detribalize one people, which happened all over the Spanish colonization areas, you take the language away, you take the practice away, you take the music away. Well, now they conform to Catholicism, but they see other groups that are still extant, and those things start bleeding in. This kind of, and the lingua franca of it all is Catholicism. So putting the universal back in the universalism is literally the meaning of Catholicism, right? That it is a Catholic world. It is literally a shell that is Catholic, in which Santo Buddha, Santa Ganesha, as well as the angels and the seraphim and whoever, anything can exist, especially from a New Spain point of view, like Mexico, Central America, if it is of utilitarian use, because that means God's letting it happen. So the Catholic side is a cultural syncretism that's happening. It is not the same as saying that someone is ortho-Catholic in the sense of like they're not necessarily looking to the Pope for all guidance. They're looking to the spiritual leaders in their own locale, and they're looking for, did this work? Is there order in the village? Are the crops growing? Are the babies booming out? Are people living long lives? And is this order maintained? Then it doesn't matter where the blessings are come from, whether it's El Amigo, the devil that lives in the mine shaft, or whether it's the witch that lives in the juniper tree, or whether it's Mary herself, pulling heaven apart and speaking to one nun once a year. So the dead are not the dead except when they are, just meaning that the conceptions of dead change, right? This idea of like, we almost don't even think of the saints as dead in Catholicism. They're almost like minor deities. And it's this demigodness, which there are many parallels to that throughout and many world traditions, but we don't think of them as the family dead in many ways. Even people who are descended from or related to canonized saints, it's this weird bar of like, they're in a different level. They're a different creature. And so this kind of flatlining of the dead that happens in many New World necromancies of like, even the gods themselves lived in the world at one point. It's a very different view than like, as I was saying, everybody's just asleep waiting for the apocalypse to come. this is not 10 minutes, sorry. Currency wise, to understand the value of commercialism, that religion and spiritual expressions in the New World are always tied into economics, because this is part of how things flow. And as what's weird is that Europe on paper likes to say that it's not tied into economics, except the church is so fucking rich. First F-bomb of the night. This idea of buying and trading deities because yours aren't working anymore, or buying and trading spirits because we like new things and we want to introduce it, or maybe your interest that catches your eye in that stall of that statue of that deity or saint or whatever it is part of the deity calling to you. It's the little darts that pierce your eye, and then you're like, okay, how do I rectify this? I buy a statue and I take it home and I have new friends. But it's important to understand that currency. And there are many forms of payment and currency, one of which is adaptation, right? So just the notion of theosophy, the theosophical logo being put into a Hungarian door there is quite interesting. But theosophy is remember that Gandhi didn't learn about the Bhagavad Gita from any cultural upbringing of his own. He learned about it because the theosophists had saved the text and published it. Similarly, the only books that were translated in Latin America by the 20th century on large and printed in Spanish were theosophical books. So the language of theosophy becomes a lingua franca across Latin America, and you have to adapt to it. But also, because of theosophy's goal or stated thing of being universal, it also gave hope to people whose traditions at other times had never been validated whatsoever. So as long as you could express things in a theosophical framework, then you were allowed at the table. You had to build the table yourself, and then you had to take it's a very difficult notion, but it isn't. You cannot underestimate the pervasive nature of theosophical terms and theosophy itself in Latin America. This also brings back just to the breath of the dead itself. Like, what are these things that are breathing life in? People read something, it gets put into practice, whether or not it's part of an existing tradition, and then that changes current opinion. People react both for it and against it, and it all comes back in this reflexive, regurgitated, mama birding manner, where some people will start to embrace the notions of purity that come with European necromancies, formalized necromancies. As you can see, they're still practiced in some areas. Other people might reject that and start to try and emphasize the indigenous side or the African side. And the truth is, it's so mixed that it's very difficult. These notions of purity are it's really hard to police them. And it's often because it has keeping up with the Kardashians type of motivation, meaning you're trying to sell your tradition and make sure that there's butts in your own pews so that you can keep up with the trend. Because it's a lot more messy. Folk traditions are always messy. So this reflexivity we're talking about, cultural identity is another part of it, that these traditions are often tied to a memory of ethnic groups that may or may not have existed in previous to colonization and enslavement. There's mythic homelands that are explored. There are new combinings of groups that were once enemies that are now friends, or like, for instance, the adoption of Nahuatl as the lingua franca of discussing anything indigenous from Mexico by the very people who were conquered by the Aztecs. So it's this thing of like using the language of your enemies from ancient times, but there's a bigger enemy, which is the European mindset that is overtaking everything. And so therefore we band together and make this thing. Or you look at something like Vodou, which is primarily Fombe framework linguistically as well, but then make sure within its framework in the popularized forms of Vodou that are still practiced, the most prominent ones have made way for all 1,000 and something ethnicities that were enslaved and brought to Haiti to find an expression in a liturgized manner. So there is an umbrella that is formed that allows everyone to find expression, whether they're remembered or not. And even the cult of the Gede, which then starts to look at the forgotten dead, and that these voices, these things can speak on behalf of that, right? So I think about that with the Egungun here, right? The Egungun is the cult of the dead, this picture on the right. This is actually a Palo Mayombe picture behind it, and I like it because it doesn't look like typical Palo Mayombe stuff. It's jars and little bundles and dolls stuffed with things. And then decolonialism itself is always going to be the thing, an engine that drives me, because I think that part of it, that there is no, you can't talk about decolonialism without practicing it. Like it doesn't work. It becomes theory. And like the idea that we are actively decolonizing it, we're not in a post-colonialism in the New World. In this notion of it's not about erasing, for me, not about erasing European footprint because I am someone who is I have multiple inheritances. It's about understanding these things and not predominantly saying this is the only right way, the unbearable rightness of it all. So I think there's just something there in exploring all these folk things. But ultimately, you know, like this lovely pinup girl in her Brugmansia covered Xochipilli, the Prince of Flowers, Prince of Hallucinogens, and the open grave that is the eternal necromancer's like bed of desire. Like in this case, folk is a term of pride. Folk is a term of reaction to, you've told me everything I do is demonic, you've told me everything I do is wrong. So folk becomes punk, right? And there's an interesting side to that there, that like, what are we folking against? You know, what are we telling the folk off? I'm not sure, but like, this is the start of 10 minutes, sorry, of where do we go from here? What is 10? Yeah. So yeah, that's it for me for now.
Hey, good times.
That was not 10 minutes. I'm so sorry.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted. Which is, you know, was the main thing. Let's be honest.
It sounded like you said undulated, and I like this term too.
I'm undulating.
Yeah,
undulated. Gosh, yeah, just so undulating right now. Yeah, gosh, this is great. This is what I wanted to happen in terms of us getting to put forward lines of why we were getting into things, where the tensions are, where these are reactions, where we get to do the classic historian. It's a little more complicated than that. Fantastic. So we wanted this time to be a chance to kind of like start to join the dots of the different things that we each chose to focus on here. I want to explore a little more around conceptions of what the folk of this is, what the folk. I wanted to, maybe we can go back to where necromancy itself isn't a useful term. Certainly, like I was saying earlier to Ben, that like the necromancy stuff of what I was putting together was pretty easy to hit. The folk of it starts to get a little squirrely in terms of pointing at a folk tradition. And when we overly dogmatize or crystallize or concentrate on the sweet candy shell rather than the delicious chocolate center, or whatever other materia gets stolen from the new world. Maybe we can also hit on some of these themes as I'm like scribbling as we're all talking about high and low magic, about church versus sorcery. And I think one of the places I want to go with that at some point is definitely to get into, you know, this idea of the necromancer as transgressive individual versus like community practices. I think that's really important and something that we all hit on in certain ways. But I think maybe we could just start off with thinking about like what's going on with folk on the front of things, right? Like whether that's folk necromancy or folk astrology, or even folk witchcraft, or being a folk witch, or gosh, even, and perhaps especially folk Catholicism and what it means to be folk Catholic for something or someone. There we go. There's Jesse's face. That was it. That's the one. Also, like, and in that same like first kind of talking point of bringing this stuff together, when is folk an unhelpful term, and when is it both broadcasting things we don't want it to, and also making it worse, making the whole thing way more complicated to talk about. Ben, you started our point on like the folk here is tricky with and outlined the Tibetan context for that brilliantly. So what do you we had a little meeting previously. Just sashay away, that's fine.
I'm just getting a drink.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, talking about like when are things folk? Like what is being communicated when people identify as a
right,
and what's going on with the practice itself.
Well, we in our previous conversation, you know, that what I found interesting was like what work, especially now, it does seem like people are regularly identifying as folk witches, and maybe in a way that they weren't doing 15 years ago, to the same extent in the same contexts, or as you said, like even a folk astrologer. And for me, the first thing I think is, okay, I think I know what you mean by folk. I'm not sure, hypothetical person, but I'm curious, like, what is the assumed inverse? What's the thing that people are distancing themselves from when they choose to say they're a folk witch as opposed to something else? So it's that kind of hidden counterpart that for me is really interesting to probe people about. It's like, okay, I think I know even just aesthetically what you would, like I can guess what your Insta feed will probably look like if you're a folk witch, but I'm not quite sure, like, what's the shadow of your and I mean, I think I would like to hear from later from others too, what that means for them, because I do feel like it's shifted a little bit, like the expectations about even a conference like this, the expectations of how people will present what they know and its value, I think is very different from what presentations on folk magic would be like 10, 20 years ago, so I don't like, it's hard for me to say anything prescriptive, like, well, because even when I was talking, I was in different moments, I was assuming that folk meant, well, of the people, non-elite, not regulated or ratified by centralized institutions. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. Like in the tantric context, like I was thinking, what on earth is folk tantra? Like, of course, there are folk tantric practices without the direct, not as much in Tibet. If you attempt to work without the direct mediation of a recognized guru, people will say, well, if it's working, that means you must be plugged in already somehow, even through past life connection. So it's kind of like what Jesse was saying with the universalism of the sort of lowercase c of Catholicism. It's like, if this thing exists and it's serving a empowering, beneficial purpose, then it must be holy. And if it's holy, then it must be a creation of God, and then it must be allowed to exist. So in some ways, folk seems very accommodating, but then in other ways, it just draws us into these weird little directions of like fetishizing certain forms of practice, and of course the problem we discussed as well of the possibility of being mistaken for like a blood and soil kind of fascist set of interests. Or but I don't know. I mean, there's
folk necromancy, never Volkish necromancy, I hope. Like yeah. And not just because fascism bad, okay, but because it flies in the face of many of the things that I value about this kind of way of engaging things. The idea of folk as a folk practice as a polycentric practice of being about communities, not about rugged individuals telling tales of their transgressive necromantic heroism. Like that was a big one. I was worried and then called to action when you mentioned that like one or two folks you'd spoken to had when you mentioned the folk necromancy group that we run, being like, oh, is that like neo folk? Are we going to get a bunch of Death in June, I just love the uniforms? Like, no, gosh, no, I hope not.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting direction to point in that, like, when describing things as folk Catholic, to the person who is doing it, they're just Catholic. They're not, there's not an Instagram byline that says I'm a folk Catholic. In the context of studying these things that are determined as folk Catholicism over the last several hundred years. As a matter of identity, it is definitely tied into modern notions of identity politics. That's its own thing. But folk by its nature is inclusive of practice, not divisive. So even though there might be the right way, according to someone, to do the best approach to do a specific working, or to worship this saint, or to work with this demon, sure. But it's about including more practices under the banner that are different from the original prescription. And that's an important notion, that it doesn't go into just like blood and land, that it can include those practices, but it's not limited to. And at the heart of this term folk for me, because I go back and forth with it. I know that for me, as I just blabbed on about, like, when it's not a choice at a certain point, what the New World is doing with its various forms of necromancy are not considered like an orthodox necromancy. I would love it. The term folk necromancy, although it is somewhat pejorative by some people, or somewhat like, oh, he's so cute, your little folk necromantic practices. But it allows possibly for something to be other than lost in 400 years of time, like that death of indigeneity, the death of the practices, just locking things in time. Folk at least allows for this idea of modernity still here. But that, and I there's an interesting thing here from Kate talking about folk astrology in the comments of kind of an oxymoron, and Porterfield is coming in. I might be speaking correctly, but I at least would say that folk astrology is absolutely a thing when we talk about hoodoo as one example, which so that's something to come back to, certainly. The notion that the literate traditions always control the orthodoxy, and that the orality and the common practice, but it's kind of like, I don't know, what on the microcosmic level or on the everyday level, like if you learn grandma's, souffle recipe, like, is that the orthodoxy? Does she teach it to you? Did she say, like, I'm teaching you the way that my grandmother taught it to you, but I like to add these things in? Is the folk variant? Is one way I can look at it. So again, like most things in my life, it's a love-hate relationship with the very term that I'm using. I also want to draw a point that I think that many people, and since this is the name of the conference too, the folklore festival, that there are people identifying as folkloric witches, which is different from a folk witch, but many people assume that folk is shortened form of folkloric, or there's a lot of blurry things there. I've also seen the complication that many people that feel that if they describe their practice as folk witchcraft, and they are not like what practitioner describes what they do as folk witchcraft, it brings in a lot of conflicting ideas about racism and classism and these things that come in under either self-labeling that, or it generates a lot of discussion at the very least. So there are people that find the term and the appropriation or the use of folk witch, like if you're describing a minority practice of people of color, then this is problematic. If you're describing your renegade version that has nothing to do with the folk, except that the folk is now a literature base that you're choosing from, which might be folkloric, you're pulling from folklore, in which case I think you brought this up the other day, Ben, that like in many terms, the people that call themselves folk witches now would have called themselves traditional witches in the 90s. And the conception there of like, what tradition are you talking about? No, traditional. One can be traditional without citing a specific tradition, although it becomes a back and forth real quickly of like, well, what did you mean by when you said these words? So labels are their own thing. Ultimately, what do you practice a deed without a name?
Yeah. And when I talk to friends and colleagues who identify as folkloric witches and practicing folkloric witchcraft, instead of this sense of like, and I have time for the rejection of elite learning and like give me back my dirt and my punk in my necromancy, but actually like folkloric witchcraft often reflects someone who is engaged in a hybridity of research and practice as well. Like like it doesn't mean I don't read books. Like it means I
often.
Yes. Yeah. I read many books, not just Israel Regade's Big Brick. Right. Yeah.
Well, what did I say in our meeting before? Is a folkloric or folk witch just a chaos magician with citations, better citations? because no, but I think there is something interesting happening with the term in the sense of, it's people frequently who are committed to experimentation and not necessarily being bound to, as you said, rigid authority or kind of orthodoxy, but then this different set of citational practices. Because I mean, imagine the difference between referring to yourself as an ancestral witch versus a folk witch, because there is some potential overlap there. But with this appeal to kind of folkloric sources in a more general way, it's more generic. It means that people can be doing research and finding affiliations and potentially working with dead magicians who they're not related to, even ethnically, culturally, in terms of their hereditary lineage, but in a way, like reading about them is part of a necromantic practice too, because they begin to work with them in a different way, and maybe in a more grounded way, because they actually have citations, in that they may not have had, if they were relying only on other sources of authority or empowerment for their magical experiments. So I think it's an open-ended. I like that it's vague, but seems to be reflecting a tendency in a culture to, as you say, walk that line of like scholarly research, independent experimentation. I'm curious what other. I don't know if there was a time when I called myself a traditional witch. I don't know if I've ever called myself a folk witch, but I actually like the term. I still don't know what it means entirely, but
I don't know if anybody who uses it truly, I mean, like it's one of those wonderful things that again, there's a community deciding this, or a larger context, multiple people, even if it's not a unified community. So when one person uses it, it gets brought into the fold of, you can argue that person's use of it is not correct, but that means that you have some notion of what is correct based on other people's uses of it. So
you're on the internet arguing about it. You're already part of the folk
exactly. And also, is it a reactionism to the idea of traditionalism in traditional witchcraft, which meant something different 20, 30 years ago, and has quickly become like, don't tell me what to do. And that side of it, that is that part of some, I've seen people propose that this notion of folk is like part of the Gen Z movement forward, which makes me feel old, because I want to be just as punk as everybody, but I don't know.
Well, you said something interesting when we spoke before, Jesse, about the death of, to like periodize or historicize some of these things, the death of key figures in like traditional witchcraft, like Chumley and others, as they become ancestors, and there's a kind of calcification of of their own innovations and exploration, like folkloric explorations, then maybe traditional witch takes on a different meaning, because now you have you've reached a new stage in your new religious movement.
Even that stage of going from just repertoire to formal archive, right? Because the 90s, the 80s and 90s, the chat rooms, the Yahoo groups that were the Usenets, that were the how traditional witchcraft started defining itself as distinct from Wicca, as distinct from the British traditional witchcraft in that way. A lot of those key figures did die in the late 90s and by the end of the first decade of the 2000s. And that was for various reasons. But their writings helped form these things and ideas that moved on. And it became this, I think there was still a residual, if I talked about Fraserism before, that there's still a little bit of Murrayism that is still in all of neo-paganism, right? That this idea that there's this universal motivation behind the witch cults. And so that was still being like played with. And I don't know how much that enters into folk, but it is interesting that like, I don't see a necessarily a deconstruction yet, but about what folk. If it was what tradition for what traditional witchcraft, but what folk, like if especially when your folk really is the community of text that you draw from, and the community of like-minded individuals, maybe, hopefully, that you're drawing from, hopefully not just arguing with online. But it's interesting of like, where does this plural folk and folks come from to describe a practice that for many people is individualistic. It's interesting. I don't know where the intersection is. I go back to the idea that like, I would never, again, the person who's practicing folk Catholicism is a Catholic in their own mind. The person who's practicing folk Orthodoxy is an Orthodox Christian in their mind. The person who's, it's all necromancy. And one version of it means that it's, what is it rebelling against if it's folk necromancy? Or what is it, how is it different from what's on the page? What is the missing stuff there? What is the familial instruction or generational relationship with material?
Yeah, absolutely. These feel, these points around, whether like with that to heresy versus blasphemy, right? Are you rejecting the thing and deciding that maybe I'm the devil, maybe I'm God, or are you considering yourself a good Catholic while you're doing some stuff a certain priest might not think of as Catholic at all in any way. And
Yeah.
for me, this kind of question of a locus of like authority and power, working in line with a lineage or with a communion of saints or what have you, or a wider community, the spiritual ecology we move through, or stealing that power and doing it for things. I think there's a tension we kind of a couple of us hit on in terms of folk necromancy specifically about academic citation, right? And on the one hand, like, you know, I'm fully on board with rejecting the imposed authority of the ivory tower, and like, you know, Chicago style like citation can be alienating for people. Like there's some class stuff going on here. On the other hand, I love the necromancy of like following in the footnotes of the dead occultists before me. And so like I can find an engagement with it where something can be useful in my practice that I can hopefully bring to the community without imposing that on others. I also feel like that itself maybe a tiny bit raises issues around like what is citation, right? Does it have to be a text? Does it have to have an ISBN number? Sasha in the comments here has made a wonderful point about all astrology starts with folk astrology. If we're going to distinguish it from the fancy maths that comes later, it starts with stories that people tell, and stories are often started by where you learned the story. And so there's this sense of like, when we are citing, when we are working in alignment with what's, you know, with who's come before us, when we're following those steps cut up the mountain from teachers or from people before us, I think that's really helpful. And I think the alternative, you know, this idea of you are doing your own thing entirely independently of anyone else, like just shoving UPG after UPG into your own practice, like fine, great for you. But the idea that you do that because you're free from consequences. Ben, you had a wonderful way of phrasing this when you talked about, I wrote it down, the unimpeachable island of the astral. Like, oh my God, I love that so much. Like, that's fine for you. That's great for you. Whatever you want, like you're not hurting no one other than maybe yourself. Well, that's for ethically as an anarchist for me, but okay. But like, no, like you are engaged. You don't get to stand outside of time or the land or the dead unless we're talking about some Imperium realm stuff. And I guess then we're back to church and state. But yeah, for me, these themes of like authority and how we are engaging with things before us, with what remains is really crucial in this stuff.
I will kind of play devil's advocate though, in a certain way. Wasn't there a moment in the conversations that Dee and Kelly had with the angels, where at one point the angels told Dee, oh, if you want that extra clarification, just seek it out in such and such volume on page such and such in your bookshelf. And, you know, by our contemporary standards, we'd be like, wow, what an amazing confirmation of the spiritual communication the angels were able to point out. But if I remember correctly, Kelly's reaction was, what is this bullshit? These are obviously lying spirits. They're giving you information you already have in books. What it like? The whole reason we're doing this is to access a book that no one has read before.
It's a real,
book,
yeah.
So,
the language of Adam, yeah.
So that's to compensate for my comment about the unimpeachable island of the astral. Sometimes the spirits agree that that's where you should seek true gnosis, but yeah, it is an interesting question, like how we're engaging with different sources.
I like this idea of what comes before, and I like Jackie's, I'm assuming this is Jackie speaking, but Jackie's saying, I absolutely identify as a folk Catholic practitioner. I'm not Catholic, but my ancestral practice is based on what I learned from my grandmother, who identified as a Catholic. And there's something interesting in that, because there's multiple levels there of what it means, because the ivory tower, the study of these things, the lens of like what calls something folk Catholic to begin with. The notion that folk Catholicism might be something that's a generational derived practice, like to call someone a folk Catholic family, but really like that sounds weird. Like we'd say that family practices folk Catholicism. It's distinctly Western magical practitioners who tend to identify as a folk Catholic as a rejection of the church's power. And that's both a luxury and a reality of what's distinctly different from the cataloging of folk Catholic practices throughout history, which are everywhere. There's the Catholic Church. So it's an interesting thing of like people who identify as Catholic being told, well, you know that the Pope doesn't agree with this side of things. And the person like, well, no, but it's fine. It's fine. You know, this is because that's how we've done it. That's what we do. You know, someone gets possessed by St. Peter every year and blesses the house, and that's just what it is. if they want a rooster sacrifice, that's what Jesus would do. Because like obviously that's what we have to do. So there's a difference between that versus you would still be Catholic, and then like the often the kind of way that we've inherited, like the Western inheritance of being able to choose identity in a different way, especially by the modern times, our current times of it's fascinating that you can say I'm not Catholic, but I identify as a folk Catholic. So it's like, what is the politics of that? Is important in what is folk there. Like it is a rejection of something. It is a rejection of the very second term that you're using in some way. So if you're a folk Buddhist, or what are you rejecting? But like I don't know. Is this the various groups that like are practicing Vajrayana sorcery without practicing Vajrayana?
Right. Well, I was just going to jump in there. I'm thinking about my field work, like about the politics of knowledge and also the representation of knowledge. Like you will hear the term folk tantric practice in academic literature about tantric and tantric adjacent ritual practice in India. But the only reason you hear about folk practice, I think, in that context is because India went from having incredibly powerful state-sponsored tantric universities and kings with it, the viziers who were tantric sorcerers, to tantra continuing to be practiced but not even being named as such. The gurus still existing but with no army standing behind them. Whereas in Tibet you have a completely different state structure. And when I was doing field, like I couldn't imagine any Tibetan practitioner saying, specifically, I'm a folk tantric practitioner. What would they I couldn't work out what they would be trying to emphasize. My experience was that when I spoke to people and said, what are your experiences as an ordinary person who lives in a tantric universe, they would usually defer knowledge. So they would say, even if they were an experienced practitioner, they'd say, oh, I don't know anything. You must talk to the guru, whose position has been installed in a lineage and is publicly known to have been authenticated to transmit officially knowledge in a particular way, especially to a prying anthropologist. So people would actually just defer esoteric expertise because of the way that, whether or not they had it, because of the way that things were set up about who could even speak. And it really absolutely depends on how, like I said, the esoteric knowledge is distributed and what the expectations are about who can speak for what. I mean, people would tell me they didn't even know Tibetan language, even though it was their first language, because they hadn't studied a grammar textbook in a monastery. They'd say, oh no, I don't really know Tibetan, but the monk over there does. You should study with him. So I mean, I think we are all navigating how we say what we know, and what we're allowed to share, and how we think we're authenticated in what we're doing, which is frequently in contemporary magic very experimental and personal, no matter what traditions we might be plugged into. So I'm just very interested in just the conversations that people have around it. I could never imagine someone saying, like I said to you in our previous meeting, sometimes I worry that the folk tantrists are the white occultists on the internet that I see as an anthropologist, and I'm like very interested by, but also horrified by as a practitioner, because I'm like, this is far from orthodoxy. Seems like a massive distortion of a lineage tradition. That I'm like, are they the folk magicians? Like maybe, like maybe in 500 years, well, someone will write a book about them and they'll have a really different status, So
from the New World perspective, certainly the reflexivity kicks in there, and like those are the same people that are going to now have their ideas that are very divergent from perhaps the standard set of beliefs now influence those, and they'll go back and forth both in reaction and in addition. So like someone who doesn't know so much, who is publishing a book that is now published, creates canon, and it doesn't matter. Right. It reminds me of what is said about Haitian Vodou, that like in the 20s when anthropologists went in and studied Haitian Vodou in Port-au-Prince, they recognized or documented the Osson tradition, of which was a minority tradition, a specific way of
and became elevated through
yes,
through visibility.
exactly. And by 50 years later, 90% of lineages in Haiti, in order to stay relevant, like keeping up with the Kardashians vibe of like, you're not going to have anybody come to your temple if you don't have a son, because that was what legitimized. Or candomblé priests in Brazil who were famous for like, you're an anthropologist, I will open up every pot for you, and you can take all the pictures because you're going to publish a book, which means my way is now the correct way. But if you're someone who practices the same thing, get out. I don't want to show you anything. I don't want to share secrets. And that was just, it's an interesting thing. It was something that Berger, who was an amazing photographer and scholar, came across of just like, as long as he was there as a photographer or an academic, everything would be open because now I legitimized it by being captioned. So it's a whole different side with the oral tradition, that side of it, especially with decentralized faiths to begin with. And necromancy, if nothing else, is not a faith. So there's just like dealing with the dead, popular conceptions of the dead, church perceptions of the dead. Certainly in Europe, the Orthodox necromantic way is like, it's saints. That's about like throughout the last 2,000 years, it's been saints. Like there's nothing more orthodoxic that, like everything else is folk in a certain way, but is folk just mean what you do with the grimoires, what you fill in, what's the breath that you read the dead letters with that then allows you to actually have a practice. I don't know.
Right. Well, in the Vajrayana context, so much of the technology of Vajrayana historically is not strictly Buddhist. It was taken from Hindu Shaiva contexts by Buddhists and then sandwiched between, refuge, bodhicitta, and dedication of merit, which makes any set of practices an authentically Buddhist practice. Well, provided it can be proven to work within a lineage and so on. But historically, we know that some of the most important kind of transgressive tantric technologies that are central to tantric Buddhism now were not Buddhist originally. But that's the whole point. Like necromancy was a set of methods, and religion and power can do what it will with those. Thanks, Al. Yeah, we're down to our last 15 minutes. Should we open up?
Supposedly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Folks want to ask some questions, that'd be great. I mean, you provided an excellent pivot point to address our last matter at hand, which we can do as people are writing down, which is to reflect on some of the posts from the actual Book of Face group that we run. That could be very, very brief. But the idea of like what gets written, what gets talked about, who's talking about it, how that's both often fascinating and occasionally horrifying for our own reasons, and how that can be helpful and help us, gain clarity and things. We get posts of a lot of natures on the group. There are a couple categories that we've noticed of kinds of things that we get. We get a lot of archaeology and the materiality of magic in the dead that are brilliant. We get a lot of stuff on. Yeah. We get a bunch of stuff on. New tomb just dropped. Wake up, babe. Yeah. We get a lot of mortuary and funeral studies, but the thing that we ended up saying that we wanted to just briefly touch on is the weird way, like we don't often know the post. Sometimes we'll get a pending post that we're very aware is going to be controversial and upset people, but the ones that have upset people that we didn't see coming are almost always food related. And I wanted to like bring that up, that like in speaking about ancestral food ways, some forum people, many of whom don't remain forum people for very long, seem to get weirdly like, that's not real wrestling. That's not real necromancy. What you eat? Nah, that doesn't count, bro.
Grandma's recipe, how dare you?
and by a bridge there, the other ones that get there is what you eat. That has nothing to do with necromancy unless you're a Catholic. And Catholicism and the church itself, like someone can bring up something that the word Catholic is mentioned once in it, and somehow a diatribe about the church and abuse and scandal is like, no one's arguing that, but we're actually, the focus of the group is different. So there's that side of it of like bringing up the policing of the term necromancy, or not necessarily folk, but necromancy seems to be something that people, they themselves are reacting against. That's not real necromancy, or like, the Catholic Church is evil and therefore I don't want them into my discussion of necromancy. I don't know. Yeah. That's a real music is another one. Lots of promos of music, which I would love to find a way to do it, but I also don't want to have to listen to each track to make sure
Right.
it's not like, do you have to submit your lyrics and like the band history? Like it becomes problematic unless we know them intimately and they're like, oh yeah, sure, promote this. But
Well, especially when people are, and not just in music, but whatever the thing, especially if it's something that might, you know, upset someone or be something that even a respectful attempt at engagement with a controversial thing, with a sensitive thing, and death and dying and bereavement are deeply personal things. The rule of thumb is often like, if you haven't like said anything, if you're just posting a link, that's really difficult because we don't know if you're saying like, hey, look at how great this terrible thing is. You haven't given a context for what it is that you find interesting about it, and it doesn't provide points to jump off and discuss, right? And for us to come together, we have to work out why you've even been moved to post that.
so just like, I'm sure this, and it's not unique to this group at all, but I do find it fascinating with the speeds with which crisis points are hit over a post. Like, you know, we were all just chatting in a common chat or something like, oh, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. And somehow overnight, like a post becomes incredibly problematic and people are like messaging like, you know, how are you moderating and what can you do to guarantee my safety? And the group are like, wow. And it's those have almost always been about the church. And because everyone seems to recognize the difference of opinion on food of like, either get with it or don't, but you don't have to be an asshole here.
Right. And not even arguing like, oh, that food doesn't count as necromantic, just rejecting the whole concept of food ways having anything to do with folk. Yeah. Bizarre.
Yeah. And even past the like, you know, putting beans in your mouth when talking to the dead, but hey.
Right. Outside of the specific realm of offerings or exactly.
Is there a way to unmute you, Charles, and have you talk? Now that you're typing is wonderful.
Come join us. I hope so.
Maybe not. Charles says in the chat, I'm particularly fascinated by folk workers, fill in the blank, who openly live lives in which they do not interact with the people out and about in the world.
I didn't think I was supposed to talk. I'm trying not to talk.
Unless invited.
That's a lie. Trying not to talk.
Yes, I am. No, there's not a lie.
There's a difference between being muted versus muting yourself.
I did mute myself. No, the point I was making is that I have encountered people who don't have a social anxiety issue. They're not necessarily introverts. They're not necessarily quiet people who live quiet lives, not necessarily of desperation, who actively are like, oh, I don't want to engage with people. I'm not interested in what's going on out there. I hate fucking people. I hate fucking culture. I want to live alone in my thing with my book and whatever. And then they say, oh, I'm a folk, whatever, fill in the blank. And I'm like, are you? Are you?
Well, here's the community, man.
Yeah.
If you don't have an interaction with folk, right? And I'm including people who are like, oh no, I don't even talk to my own family. Like if that was just, oh, I don't want to talk to others, but I talk to my own family, I could go, well, then that's a kind of folk, right? At least you're interacting with somebody. But no, I'm particularly fascinated by folk workers, folk, whatever, fill in the blank, who are like, people, culture, society. And I'm like, that's folk, right? This idea that folk becomes a past thing, not a thing that's going on. That was all I wanted to say. Thank you for letting me speak. Appreciate it.
Yeah. It makes me think of Never Trust the Living, right? Which, you know, this time and place for certain living, but the alternative to just, again, specifically in a necromantic, you know, context, spending all your time in the kingdom of the dead and not enjoying being alive isn't necessarily what all our, you know, nice ancestors that poured their blood and bones forth like might have had in mind for us, you know,
by eating food to make our bodies, you know.
Right. Imagine that. No, that doesn't sound necromantic at all. Then,
but are those misanthropes maybe, you know, are they hanging out in the tropical unimpeachable island of the astral plane? You know, I mean, because there's a question of if you don't like interacting with people, especially as part of your spiritual work, then maybe there's also an anxiety about being held accountable or having to be answerable to said people too. I mean, the classic sort of anthropological critique of the neo shaman or whatever you want to call it was that there's no community functionary quality to what's happening in your weekend workshop. Well, there can be, but it just doesn't have to be, you know. You're not like driven to madness because you have to serve or else, you know. So yeah. I mean, I'm willing to be charitable. Folk can also include non-human people, right? Non-human communities. And those can be enriching, but yeah, I don't know. There's something about being in your bedroom, you know, and with your books that just feels very insulated.
Yeah, and I feel like, yeah, in a kind of last minute, 5 minutes, where we can continue answering questions and kind of wind up any things we wanted to get out. That idea of trying to get away from just books and also address, you know, gosh, things happening outside the Anglosphere and like orality and hybridity and those kind of things, while also maybe having time for acknowledging that like books can also be of the dead in some way, and that those can also be, you know, not just the oppression of the archive, but can potentially at least be stolen to do some fun things in the repertoire as well. Jesse, correct me if I'm using those terms wrong.
No, yeah, these things are wonderfully problematizing. I'm not even saying problematic. Like it's good. They generate, like that's the beautiful thing about such labels. You know, I think I love one of the it's the wind up and go. It's the clockmaker god thing with these types of terms. Like I don't remember seeing, and I don't think we've mentioned that. I do not remember seeing the term folk necromancy before you started using it out. And I will be the one that points out, like, I'm happy to see other people. I'm not doing it as like, I was the creator of, but like, it's an interesting thing to see then how it was used very quickly by other people. And that's its own fascinating thing of like, wind up and watch it go, of like, you know, be careful what you put out there in the world. I'm also the type of person that believes that you should treat, most people already do, but you should treat all books as if they are dead. In the sense that like, most people are not going to write the author and engage with the author in any meaningful conversation other than I liked it or I didn't like it. But so it is a one-way conversation that you're completely filling in, which is, you know, that's my eternal argument, right? That all reading is an act of necromancy. But does that make it folk? Like, if we have nothing but dead friends, is it like folk necromancy squared? If you're reading about necromancy by authors that you're never engaging with except through their books and your own impeachable island of the astral, like, you know, is there an exponential on the folk and an exponential on the necromancy? Which is, hey, why the folk not? Why the folk not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you know, it's something that we keep coming back to, is like disavowing constructions of purity, or at least, you know, rigorously assessing what kind of purity is are we alleging is occurring, or to be appealed to, or to be rejected. Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point around, you know, individual experience and expression and experimentation against centers of power, or like in the course of having to interact with, you know, the borders that cross us in terms of authority and power and things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Matthew says, I indeed think that for some people, folk without being volkish is in reference to ancestors and ancestral practices. Yeah, I can see that. There's also, I think, a proposed universality by folk that we are diving into and have looked at a little bit. I think that's, I come back to the term folk magic, and you often hear folk magic is universal. Like the techniques of folk magic are used around the world without, you know, the cultural umbrellas or the paradigms that are using it. It's a different deity that powers it, or if it's a different thing, but we're talking about ultimately like Fraserian codified things, whether you're going from like contagion and but metaphor and metonym being the common, you know, the academic versions of those things, but contagion and sympathy, excuse me. But yeah, and then Charles responds, I look forward to a time when we have people who, as their work, only do work based around other folk magicians and call themselves folk magicians. Exactly, folk squared. Mary Ellen saying that, thinking about their Pennsylvania Dutch folk practices or earlier mentions today on the Ozark folk magic, it's almost built into the practice in such a way that it's formed its own state. Yeah, gatekeepers abound, for sure. The question is like, how can we decodify our own use of these terms? Folk redux, that's hilarious, Kate. Like, you know, it is interesting because the words have meaning, and that's how we communicate. But how do we predicate what we're talking about, which is part of what this panel is. And like
starts in the magic circle.
Yeah, yeah, and by extension, like even you know, if I can plug the podcast there, of like, I think that's one of the benefits of the Sesame Streeting, which is it serves our ADHD brains, and you know, long live neurodivergence. But it just the idea that connections will be made between all these things as they are. We look for patterns as humans, and so it can be very easy. Sometimes it's great just to expose yourself to the information, and then have a chat about it with people. And ultimately, you know, you don't always agree on everything, but that is indeed our podcast, Radio Free Golgotha. It is beyond semi-regular. It is, you know, occasionally it falls from the heavens.
But yeah, we have a lovely friend of the family who's won awards for his podcasting, who's given us a hand with editing and things. And it'd be nice to get together and record some more episodes as well. I also, it was, you know, as we're closing out, if you know, if you're interested in your own engagement with some black books, some of which are literally black and some of which are merely about, you know, blackening, we might say. Yeah, also wanted to brag, just be proud of some of the work that we've done with many books. Yeah, folk brag about the work we've done with many authors and with the amazing Dr. Jen Zart.
Who's also presenting this weekend.
Who's talking about posthumous astrology, appropriately enough. So yeah, absolutely check that out. She did a little taster of it for a Speakeasy of the Dead we did a while ago, our online cabaret for fancy necromancers. And everyone was rapt. We were like, have all the time you want. Keep talking, Dr. Zed. But yes, we've got a bunch of works that we've worked on, whether the Cipriana Old World, which contains essays from myself and afterward from Jesse and many of our pals and colleagues, to gosh, this compendium by the late Dr. Thomas Johnson on the Swedish black art books traditions. To a bunch of other things. So we're trying to put some things, trying to make new books of the dead as well.
I think a way to kind of end it for me is that, you know, in lieu of all these things and like gatekeeping and all these things, ultimately I like the term folk as inclusive. That's really where it's coming from, is an inclusive way of talking about and not drawing fences around any such term. That, you know, whether it's telling the little old lady that what she's doing is a proper Catholic and that's not what her opinion of it is, or to, you know, whether we're talking about food and saying that's not necromantic, it is if the person thinks it's necromantic. And if, you know, if we can have a heated debate about it afterwards, that even so much for the better.
Yeah. Any final thoughts for us, Ben?
No, just here. I agree.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Apparently,
so much.
we've also generated many T-shirt ideas unexpectedly. So,
right, do we understand vertical integration now?
Do we understand what?
Vertical integration now. We come for the necromancy, stay for the T-shirts.
yeah. Side hustle.
Yeah, Charles, you are not peeling a piece of fruit with a pocket knife while you say that he refuses to accept it as folk bragging.
Good point.
Never trust a Porterfield with an apple, though. That's what it comes to.
Look, he was ensuring that people took it of their own free will. He was insisting that they knew they took it from their own free will. What's weird about that?
I recognize a snake coiled around a tree when I see one. If only I'd been so wise as to take his fruit.
All right, well, folks, thank you so much for being here. Thanks, obviously, thanks to my dear pals Ben and Jesse. Thanks for going on this merry jaunt with me. Thanks to the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival for having us. Thank you to Jackie for looking after us all in this Zoom classroom. Thanks to everyone here who was making some wonderful comments and questions and sharing their perspective on these kinds of things. These are questions that we enjoy talking about, and I find it fruitful and helps with my clarity and enthusiasm. So hopefully we've I hope you get to feel a little bit about how excited I got to feel about doing this. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swiffer. And this is a really good example of the kind of dialogue that we hope to continue with, whether it's through inviting people on the podcast in the forum proper, or even the speakeasies. And I really, we'll make an effort to do more of those. But thank you again for allowing this space to be held, Jackie and Matt and everybody at the festival. So.
Well, I want to thank our 3 presenters this evening, Dr. Al Cummins, Jesse Hathaway Diaz, and Dr. Ben Joffe.
Not
Huh?
Yeah, not here. Thanks for emphasizing that.
Not yet. Not with that attitude.
Well, yeah.
So tomorrow we are kicking off bright and early at 10 a.m. I've got friends in low places and low countries, folk magic in the Netherlands with Nate Nordman, A Dimpled Chin and a Devil Within, folk magic and body lore with Corey Thomas Hutchison, and the mysteries of Hecate with Stephanos Chiladorius. So 10 a.m. Don't forget to join us if you haven't registered for those classes yet. Please do so. And this festival is going on until Sunday. We are closing it out with the Folk Around and Find Out 2 back in the Habitat panel with Dr. Al Cummins, Jesse Hathaway Diaz, Professor Charles Porterfield, Brandon Weston, Doc Beverly Smith, and Aaron Hodges. So if you haven't registered for that, you may want to do that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.